This is the Code to Cash podcast.
Welcome to the Code to Cash podcast. This is your host Ajit again. Today we have Aunik Pachari. He's the Senior Director of Deal Enablement at Attentive. He's also spent quite a few years with the growth journey at Elastic, and he was the Global Director of Sales, Finance, and Deal Desk, and has a very, very interesting background. So welcome to the podcast, Aunik.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Would love to, before we jump more into the topic of deal desks, I would love to understand your story a little bit. How did you end up in this role?
Sure. Yeah. So my initial experience in my career was primarily in consulting and finance. I worked a little bit at Accenture. I actually went to trade equities on a trading desk for a couple of years.
Mm.
And then I found myself back in the world of financial consulting at Deloitte in the Bay Area. Being in the Bay Area at that period of time, a lot of hyper growth startups. And that's kind of how Elastic found me. And I found Elastic. They hired me under the finance organization as a general financial analyst role, not really knowing where I needed to, apply my skill set or what really needed to be built to what would eventually become, our deal desk function at Elastic. So going into that role, I essentially utilized my consulting experience to drive the primary three pillars of consulting, right? Which is assessing, planning, and executing against business needs. And so that's kind of how I organically found myself in what would eventually become a deal desk role. And I joined Elastic very early, around 200 employees. And in doing so, understanding the business needs and building that deal desk function. And I was there for 6 years. That company is quite large, and I think over 2,000, 3,000 employees. And now I'm just trying to translate and build the same function here at Attentive, which is a very similar company profile in terms of being hyper growth, a lot of complexity, and really scaling to meet the business's needs.
Interesting. These sort of environments are really a treasure trove of learning. So, really happy to see your growth there. Also curious, in the organization, you joined at a sort of different role, and then it morphed into deal desk. What was happening in the organization that required this role to even exist?
When I joined Elastic, it was a very, as you'll typically find with, startup companies, very sales-driven organization. And that doesn't necessarily cease to be the case as scale happens. But what that results in, obviously, is the primary focus is just getting contracts out, getting customers on your customer list, driving revenue growth. And while that focus is very important, what that results in is a lot of things getting lost in translation, whether that be data, whether that be translation of contract terms, especially those ones that are non-standard for your more strategic customers. And that was what kind of drove that evolution was, okay, we have contracts being done by sales reps in a Word doc template. And that was the first initial part of the assessment. Okay, we just need better controls around data. From the controls and the data perspective, that is just what I consider table stakes. You just need good data pipeline for your quote to cash processes. What eventually happens, though, and what I try to focus my skill set on, again, using my consulting background, using my finance background, is value add processes. How do we actually inject and add value to what most consider just to be, hey, create a quote, generate an order form, book the deal? What else could we add value on, whether it's for the finance leaders, whether it be to the sales leaders, or cross-functionally to the legal team, to the product team, to the product marketing team? And how do we kind of act as what I like to call like a hub and spoke model, making Deal Desk essentially the hub for our go-to-market strategies while also providing value of data pipeline, data quality, and integrity. So that is the general evolution of the role. And I think for any new person going into a new company, building a deal desk function, that is kind of how I think about it, is build controls that work, build data that works, and then you're able to kind of start focusing on the value add areas of the business, which I'm sure we'll get into here shortly.
Yeah. So make sure that the controls are in place, make sure that the data is flowing. And when you're saying value add, what sort of things are you referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone in this role today, your job is to act as a bridge, right, between
Mm-hmm.
sales and finance as a primary
Mm-hmm.
primary
Mm-hmm.
competency. Like regardless of where your role's up to, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
your role. The other thing is like implementing an ongoing focus on like what matters the most to the business. Like, is that
Mm-hmm.
revenue? Is that customer acquisition? Is that gross margin? And what I really try to focus on is what does the business need now? And that is not only something that is important, but that's also something that evolves over time. So as I mentioned, coming into a new role, take that consultative approach. And I mentioned data, those current quote to cash workflows, also
Yeah.
understanding like what is your go-to-market motion and having a almost like a subject matter expert level of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
understanding of that. That an initial like initially setting that foundation, that includes like what are your bookings policies, what are your go-to-market policies,
Right.
what is our deal playbook? How do we sell things? Do
Right.
we
Right.
co-term all of our agreements, or are we a multi-product company? And that's just building that foundation, building that
Or,
initial guidance. What's very interesting to me in organizations and across Elastic and Attentive and other businesses that I've
mm-hmm.
consulted for in the past is basically standardizing as a first motion, standardizing your highest transactional sales group. Most of the time, it's going to be your mid market, your SMB customers. And before you can go start standardizing what is maybe more complicated deals, you have to understand what is our standard sales motion and what is a typical deal profile for that sales group. So
Mm-hmm.
mid-market SMB, that's what maybe, eventually as companies scale becomes almost like your run rate business, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have a high volume of transactions and you need a standard way to execute against all of them. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the primary competencies that I think about for Deal Desk is taking over time the number of deals that you do and standardizing a larger percentage of them
Makes
as you
sense.
scale your
Mm-hmm.
business. And
Mm-hmm.
so within that, there's a lot of value add areas that the business eventually starts needing once you can build that foundation.
Got it. So, as when you were in the role, did you create a lot of the policies if they did not exist already?
That's right. Yes. So
Yeah.
we worked with finance and again acting as that bridge to
Yeah.
understand how do we recognize revenue? That is
Yeah.
incredibly important just to understand is what is
Mm-hmm.
our revenue recognition policy? What are the processes back office that are not just focused on revenue recognition, but also accounting principles, any carve outs I might be doing? Are we subject to 606 SSPs? All of those things are critical to
Mm-hmm.
understand as you craft those policies. So I think bookings policy is maybe the first one I start with because it's just, hey, what do we need to recognize an order? But
Right.
that also dovetails into more complex things. Like if you're a multi-product company, do you have a coterminous policy that you need to co-term agreements? What is a discounting strategy if you are co-terming agreements?
Got it.
Or if you're not
Got it.
co-terming agreements, what are those things? And so
Makes sense. Makes sense.
understanding all of that is baseline, and then building
Yeah.
systems to fit into that is the next step. And that is again just from the baseline quote to cash process, not
Right.
quite
Right.
deal strategy.
Makes sense. This is awesome because, many times I just had a side comment here is that the structure to building this function, there is a sort of a habitual way of people solving this function. And what I've noticed is the policies sort of all blend in. And
Mm,
yeah, it's nice to hear that you're very specific about, okay, RevRec is one, discounting policy is another, the quote to cash systems is another, but you haven't even gotten to deal strategy yet. So you're first building these pillars based on which this is working. And uh, I think in some companies there is an assumption that we will be told these policies, but
mm,
we cannot come up with that. So I think that's where your consulting skill set really helps to
right.
bring out like what should this be? Let's do it in a structured, systematic fashion before we build the sort of day-to-day part of it.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Mhm. And okay, so coming to deal strategy, so what are the elements that you are like thinking about once the sort of foundation has been laid out?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at Elastic, it was finance oriented to start and then eventually working. And eventually that role slowly got morphed into, a function that supported the sales organization, even though I still sat within finance.
Yeah.
The current role, I actually wanted this when I was hired, was to report into, the sales organization and the leadership function and
Got it.
focusing on what they care about, right?
Mm,
Supporting
mm,
that hyper growth. And so what the sales organization cares about when it comes to deal strategy, obviously time to close is a primary
mhm.
one, especially
Yeah.
as company scales, sales efficiency, and
Mhm.
one that I think is is maybe overlooked often is accountability, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
what I mean by accountability is, hey, we published all these policies, we have these deal strategies, reps have quotas, et cetera. But how do we ensure that the deals that we are doing are setting us up for future success, right? We don't want to end up in a position as a company where we're racing to the bottom, where hopefully if you're in an industry where your product is not commoditized, you're able to continue to drive value selling motions based on your product suite. And so what that eventually morphs into in terms of supporting the sales organization on a macro level is clear, easy to understand reporting, KPIs, dashboards are your best friend for
mm,
executives, especially
mm.
CROs that, are
Yeah.
pulled in a
Mhm,
bunch of different directions. Monthly or periodic emails like, hey, here's an update. Those get lost in the shuffle. So how do you scale your data infrastructure? How do you expose that data in a way that's meaningful?
mhm,
And when I talk about reporting and dashboarding, it's not just providing a bunch of numbers to your leaders.
mm,
There's definitely an element of giving context or contextualizing the analysis or the data that you're providing. So whenever you're thinking about reporting or rolling up key KPIs or metrics to leadership, you always
mhm,
need to provide that context. What is the baseline? What am I comparing these figures against? Is that good or bad? And so before you just roll out a bunch of reporting processes and structure, you need to have aggressive alignment with leadership. What
mm,
do you care about? How do we create a baseline and how do we then manage on a micro level, kind of getting to the more
mm,
specific deal strategy? How do we provide building blocks, meaning the blocks themselves or each deal that you sign to help drive the right behavior across those metrics and drive the
mm,
right
mm.
trends?
Makes sense. Okay, in terms of executives, like executives may not know everything that you know. Sellers also may not know everything that you know. I'm curious on the executive side, right? What are maybe common misconceptions that maybe a CEO or even a CFO or maybe some other CRO may have that you have to work on with them or educate them? I'm sure there are things, but I'm
Yeah.
curious what you have to deal with on this side of the equation or the sales side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I talked about reporting for a moment, but kind of
Yeah.
just going back to those building blocks. Many leaders aren't as focused on the tactical execution of a deal, right? They are
Mm,
focused on driving customer value, meeting them on commercial negotiations, and just closing the deal. At a high
yeah.
level, that's what they care about, right? So
Mhm,
when it comes to nuances around contract negotiations, that is where, we need to do our best to explain the so what. Why does this little thing that the customer is saying, why does that actually create friction within the specific deal cycle? And so
mhm,
I really rely on, again, I mentioned those revenue and accounting concepts. Those are all contexts that maybe a CRO isn't privy to. Maybe
mhm,
they want to give some sort of non-standard pricing commitment to this customer that might trigger SSP considerations, right? Or manual accounting processes that will result of doing like a non-standard deal in that nature. So a running talk track for me is that question. So what? Like customer
mhm,
said this, we're at an impasse. So what? I mentioned the revenue
mhm,
accounting piece, but the other part of this is giving and getting, right?
mhm,
In my current role, I actually play a pretty large part of the negotiation piece. That also includes like getting on customer calls, talking to
mhm,
their procurement group. And that
mhm,
so what concept doesn't just
mhm.
apply internally, that also applies externally. So driving the right customer outcomes, but making sure you have a clear line of communication and
Mhm.
building trust and influence within your sales organization. Because
Got it.
look, executives, leaders are very busy. They
Yeah.
may not have the time to dig in on everything. So you need to
Mm.
build that trusted advisor relationship so
Yeah.
that what initially is a bunch of questions that you're helping explain eventually just becomes, hey, Aunik, you know what you're doing. Like, go run
Yeah.
with that. And I trust
Yeah.
what the outcomes will be.
Yeah. Makes sense. And as far as it pertains to the other side, the seller side of the equation, what is maybe the more challenging part of the role?
Yes, that is a great question. I always tell anyone that I'm interviewing, that one of the key things that I'm looking for is personality management, right?
Hmm.
I hate to use this phrase, but a lot of people, the phrase in industry is, salespeople are quote unquote coin operated, right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
just trying to get the deal done. They don't really care about these internal considerations that I'm bringing up. And so managing personalities is a huge part of that. But maybe more importantly is again that aggressive alignment up front.
Yeah.
What you want to have in a sales organization is not only alignment with leadership, CROs, VPs of sales, but you also want to have the frontline managers on your side, right? It's your job to drive alignment with the people that those AEs and CSMs report to. If there's misalignment between managers and deal desk, that will eventually present itself in a lot of friction, right? Like, why can't we do this deal? It's the end of the quarter. We need to get this done. And that's where things kind of get topsy-turvy, where you're not then operating in a, one of our Attentive's principles is like be one unstoppable team. And the team aspect there is just incredibly critical to that. And so I know you asked about the sellers themselves, like what do they care about? It's really important to be clear. Driving clarity is almost my number one priority when it comes to interacting with account executives. Ensuring you have just incredible clarity. And one nuance there is maybe you don't, in your deal desk role, you're not responsible for setting quota or compensation plans.
Yeah.
But those deal playbooks that you're structuring, the policies that you're structuring, you need to make sure that that compensation plan is in direct alignment with the strategies that you're publishing, that you're putting out there to tell them, hey, this is exactly how we need to operate.
Makes sense. So, because if you're doing something that is working against their purposes, then that could be an issue. So there was a seminal article written by Ben Horowitz in the tech community on product management. It's called Good Product Manager, Bad Product Manager. And it's one of the ones that I really enjoy reading because it helps. Well, I was a young sort of PM. It helped me put into context, what should I be doing in the role? So if you were to say, do a similar thing with me verbally, right? What makes a good deal desk leader, bad deal desk leader, or not even leader? Like, what is a good deal desk function, bad deal desk function? How would you contrast these two?
Yeah, great question. It's actually one that I think about quite frequently. And, my answer and one of my principles in being a deal desk leader is lead with yes. It's never a good experience for anyone in the organization that's trying to do what's right for the company, which is get a deal done, right? We want to get this customer on board. So rather than just saying, sorry, you can't do that, or sorry, that is out of policy, the answer should be, let me see how we can work that out. Let me see how we can actually drive resolution and lead with yes instead of leading with no. And so while it's important to have those policies and getting alignment and all those things, that all that does is serve as a backdrop for the guidance that you provide to those teams. So in terms of a simplistic takeaway for any of our listeners here is try to lead with yes and don't lead with no. And then in addition to leading with yes, it's why are you leading with yes, and the reasons that drive within that specific deal. Take that as a learning experience. Take that as a learning unit. I know often it's saying, oh, well, that's a one-off exception that we approve for this deal. Well, maybe there's other deals, and doing that deal actually opens up new avenues to revenue growth, new avenues to different deals. So lead with yes, and then collect your deals that were potentially non-standard over time and standardize them. Don't always consider the non-standard deal structure as a one-off exception, but think about how you can actually build infrastructure in standardizing what is maybe today considered a non-standard deal, which tomorrow you can make a standard deal motion.
Interesting. So that is the good deal desk leader or function is leading with yes. They're figuring out the common patterns and they're sort of systematizing them so that this thing is actually scaling. What does a poor deal desk function look like?
I would say a worst deal desk function is just focused on process. I think too often, and I know deal desk teams, take a lot of different formats. Sometimes it's just deal strategy. Sometimes, like in my role, it encompasses both. We have two teams. We have an order operations team, and then we have a deal strategy team. And so I think one pitfall of the deal desk function is having a process-driven team, whether that be within the deal desk function or not, and having a deal strategy team that are not in concert. One thing that we really predicate our success on is the deal strategy analysts that are helping drive resolution and building these non-standard contracts. They're in constant communication with order operations, with billing, with accounting. And a bad deal desk function doesn't do that, number one. And number two, transparency. You want to be transparent with your sellers as to what you're doing, what guidance you're giving, and why you're giving that guidance. It's not just saying, sorry, we can't do that. It's explaining, hey, if we can't do that, why we can't do that. And I think that is, again, a major pitfall of deal desk organizations is to just like link them to a policy and say, this is out of policy, rather than saying, let me help you get that deal done. And this is why there's a little bit of friction here, but I'll help you resolve that friction so we can get this over the line.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, there are so many perspectives, but I definitely have encountered those functions where they just say, okay, well, you did not meet the discounting policy, so you can't do it.
Right. Right.
There's no logic, there's no debate, and then the sellers get frustrated and they try to work around the system rather than with the system. Makes sense. If, generally, you said you sometimes report into sales organizations, sometimes report into finance organizations. If I guess a CFO or a CRO is hiring for this role, what would you generally recommend? What sort of background person should they be trying to get in, somewhere around like maybe the 200, 300 employee mark is, the type of person that they should think about bringing in?
Absolutely. I think organization is a primary
Mhm.
competency. Another important skill set to have is just leadership interaction. How
Mhm.
does this person talk to people? How do they collaborate? Project managers is actually a role that I sometimes look for because look, you
Okay.
can learn all about 606, you can learn all about
Interesting.
accounting, you can do
Mm,
all of that stuff, but being able to cross-functionally drive alignment is an
mm,
absolute critical skill set to have. Other things can be learned on the job, I would say,
mm.
but being a good PM and having analytical background is another one. We've talked a lot about process, we talked a lot
Yeah.
about discounting strategy, but analytics play a big part of this, right? Just as
Yeah.
an example, we are now at the sophistication on our side where we're actually looking at pricing and packaging, strategies. And how do we look at those pricing and packaging strategies, see how these individual building blocks of deals ladder up to what eventually is your FP&A plan, your revenue
Yeah.
plan, your revenue
Mm,
forecast. So
mm,
being able to start with the foundation, utilizing alignment, driving alignment, and then eventually ending up in a place where you have a foundation that you can work off of and build analytics off of to drive really business critical, touch points to say, hey, our pricing and packaging strategy isn't working out because we're seeing, for example, 80% of our deals at this heavy discount or
yeah.
70% of our
Yeah.
deals. And that actually will result in us missing plan. It's
Yeah.
not always just sales efficiency and RevOps
Totally.
matrix around
Totally.
converted to paying, but it's
Totally.
also about how we're actually executing those individual deals. So I would say
Makes sense.
project management skills, analytical background, and being
Mm,
personable and being able to work and talk to leaders.
makes sense. All right. Close to the end of my questions, but one of the other questions on technology. Now, that was something you had alluded to at the beginning, but I'm curious, one, are there any sort of missteps that people can avoid when it comes to the stack? And associated with that, what role, if any, do you think AI has to play in this, evolution of this stack?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for new organizations specifically, meaning where Deal Desk doesn't exist, I think technology plays one primary role, and that is we talked about data integrity, how that data pipeline, but also there's an element of what I like to call intended friction, right?
Mm, mm.
Where sales organizations, I can call it the Wild West, or they're just kind of doing whatever they want and they're, closing deals and that's fine. As organizations evolve, you have to get to a point where you can start controlling how you scale. Rather than just scaling, you need to scale in a controlled manner. And that's really where technology plays a really incredible part of this, right? So the one pitfall that I often see in industry is people over-engineer their CPQ instance, right? Without
Mm,
thinking about future state, right? This is the
mm,
whole build versus buy,
mm,
overly customizing whatever you're building, rather than just starting off with here's the basic building blocks that will allow us to potentially change strategy in the future. Attentive right now is, going through a digital transformation. We were an SMS first company for so many years. Now
okay.
we're starting to sell email. Okay,
Mm.
well, our CRM infrastructure wasn't built with that in mind. And so
Yeah,
that was,
yeah.
a common pitfall. So in general, you want to make sure you give yourself flexibility for business evolution in whatever you're building on the technology side. You mentioned AI. It's a very, very interesting area of the organization right now. I think if AI could do anything, it's like, hey, can you learn how to speak to an AE in a manner that supports essentially all the concepts that I raised? Being
Interesting.
transparent,
Mm,
bringing in prior deal profiles to explain, hey,
mm.
we've done this for prior deals. And again, going back to my point around standardizing non-standard deals,
Interesting.
utilizing AI to say, hey, you know what?
Interesting.
We've
Yeah.
seen this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times.
Makes
maybe it's
sense.
worth looking at that. So I think there's two roles that AI can play. One is obviously with monetize like AE interaction,
Yeah.
making that seamless and just making deal desk teams much more efficient. But
Yeah.
I also think AI potentially has a part to play in bubbling up and exposing information that might be blind, to an average deal desk analyst or a deal desk leader, things that they're not thinking about that can bubble up trends and patterns to say, hey, you need to actually look at these types of deal profiles, and maybe it's worth, building a framework around them to support selling them in a more standardized manner.
Awesome. Awesome. Great answer. Great answer. All right. So last question is, what was the most weird or, insane deal that you've ever worked
Yeah.
on? And
Yeah,
on,
great question. Every time anyone asks me a question, I have the answer on the tip
yeah.
of my tongue. At my time at Elastic, which is an open source data company software, back when I was there, and I know the landscape has changed in the last 10 years, we sold on-premise licenses. So now it's a primarily cloud-driven business, but back
Yeah.
then we'd offered both hybrid, like on-premise and cloud. We were involved with a very, very large customer, one of the biggest computing brands in the world. And we were initially positioning a cloud deal, but because, back then a lot of considerations around security, needing air-gapped instances, that type of thing, they actually wanted to run our software on bare metal, right? Bare metal meaning they wanted to just install the software on machines,
Yeah.
Elastic directly onto their machines. Now, the problem there was they are also a manufacturer of said machines. And so they wanted to work out a deal with us where they essentially purchased those on-premise licenses from Elastic, but also worked out a deal with us where we actually provided the machines purchased from them. And so this has created a very convoluted sales cycle where we are
Yeah.
basically, and the reason we did this, by the way, is a very strategic logo. It's someone
Yeah.
that we wanted to have machines dedicated for to
Yeah.
drive long-term benefit. So that the reason that deal was so sticky is because all of a sudden you think you're selling just software, and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're working with your own procurement team on
Yeah.
how to purchase hardware
Yeah.
from this potential customer. So it was a lot of back and forth. It was two-way negotiations. It was working through discounting. It was working through security. And so it really touched all the aspects of what one would qualify as a non-standard deal, from legal negotiations to pricing considerations to physical procurement of goods
My
to
God.
physical implementation of software. And so that was probably the hairiest. And I know that on-premise world is slowly fading into the distance.
Yeah.
But in terms of that one war story, that sales cycle took 18 months to close that
Wow.
deal. And
18
not
months.
only 18 months to close the deal, but then there was, because of the hardware impact, another 6-7 months to actually get everything up and running for that customer.
Amazing. Wow. Such a weird deal.
Yeah. Absolutely bizarre.
Awesome. Well, Aunik, this was amazing. I think, you really are very, very structured, very well thought through in this field. And I mean that's actually not that common in the field. So thank you so much for being on the
Of
podcast to share
course.
your views. And yeah, thanks again for the time.
Of course. Thank you.